At a popular diner in Waterbury, Connecticut, 52-year-old Gina Hale finished the last bites of her lasagna, being careful not to leave behind even a speck of the rich, delicious cheese. Across the table, her 55-year-old brother, Tony, downed his cheeseburger. This restaurant had been their hangout since they were kids, and whenever they came to this diner, where the old jukebox still had songs from the 1980s, it made them feel like they were teenagers again. From the moment they sat down on this July day in 2012, they were both wiping tears of laughter from their cheeks. Seeing Tony this happy made Gina smile. He'd been battling depression for a while now, and had finally gotten on the right antidepressants to help him feel like himself again. But as Gina watched Tony take a sip of his beer, she couldn't help but feel concerned. Now, with anybody else, a beer with lunch was no big deal. But Tony had abused alcohol for many years, and Gina couldn't hide her concern anymore. But Tony didn't even let Gina get a word out before he promised her this would be his last beer before he quit drinking cold turkey. Gina gave her brother a weak smile, trying hard not to remember all of his previous failed attempts at getting sober, which included 4 attempts at an actual rehab facility. She hoped this time it would stick, because all the drinking had really taken its toll on her brother. A little while later, when they got up to leave, Gina noticed that her brother was a bit slower than usual as he inched his way out of the booth. Out in the parking lot, Gina gave Tony a big hug as he hopped on his Harley and promised her he was okay to ride. He had the same brown eyes as their mother, and for a split second, it was like their mother's face flashed in front of Gina's eyes. Their mother had been an alcoholic too, and she eventually had died of cancer. And so as Gina watched her brother ride off down the street, she hoped he was not following in his mother's footsteps. Three weeks later, Gina broke a pane of glass at the back of her brother's house, then pried open the window and climbed inside. Gina hadn't heard from Tony in a few days. After their lunch they had together, he'd quit drinking cold turkey just as he'd promised. But it had not gone well. He'd been overcome by a condition called delirium tremens, which is when the body starts to shut down from alcohol withdrawal. Tony had been forced to spend an entire week in the hospital to recover, but he'd gotten through the worst of it, and Gina had hoped that this time he'd be able to stay sober. But now, it was clear something was wrong. Gina didn't know if Tony had gone into withdrawal again or maybe fallen off the wagon. But either way, he never just went radio silent like this. And now, looking around at the inside of his house, Gina knew it was bad. She crept through the rooms, calling her brother's name over and over, but there was no response. The unventilated house felt like an oven. As she wiped the sweat from her face, she looked at the dirty dishes and the overflowing garbage in the kitchen. She hadn't heard from Tony in days, and now, finding his home in this condition, she just couldn't stop the panic rising in her chest. Just then, a yellow streak flashed past her and she jumped. Her brother's tabby cat was suddenly at her feet, brushing up against her legs and yowling for attention. Gina could see that the cat's food dish was empty, and so she wondered why Tony hadn't fed his cat. As Gina was about to feed the cat just took off running down the hall and disappeared through the open door to the basement. Gina followed the cat down the hall, she turned to go down the stairs, she flipped on the basement light, and immediately she stopped. That's when she found her brother. Tony lay crumpled in a motionless heap down on the basement floor. Gina ran down the stairs to his side, and she could immediately tell he was badly hurt. His hair was matted with blood, his skin was a yellowish gray, and he had dark bruises all over his legs. Tony looked like he'd been lying there for a while, maybe even days. Gina pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. After she described what was going on, the dispatcher asked if Tony was breathing. Gina shakily replied that she couldn't tell. But just then, Tony's mouth opened and he began to cough. And as he gasped for air, his cracked, dry lips tried to form words. Gina begged the dispatcher to send help right away. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Gina took her brother's hand and leaned in close to hear what he was trying to say. But she couldn't make it out. He was just babbling something. And soon, his mysterious whispers were drowned out by the sounds of the ambulance pulling into the driveway. Three hours later, Gina sat down in the only seat left in the crowded ER waiting room, a tiny plastic chair in the kids' play area. As she sat there, she ate a bag of chips from the vending machine, wishing she had something more filling to eat. But mostly, she just couldn't stop thinking about the sight of her brother at the bottom of the basement stairs. his body twisted from the long fall. She really had thought Tony was dead, and she felt so grateful that he had a pulse when the EMTs finally reached him. Gina shifted uncomfortably in her chair for a few more minutes until the waiting room door swung open and a doctor finally called her name. Gina raced up to him, bracing for the worst. Tony was still alive, the doctor explained, but barely after his fall down the stairs. Tony had a severe concussion that may have damaged his brain, and he had suffered so much damage to his muscles in the fall that his kidneys had shut down. The doctor said he very likely would need dialysis, which is a process in which machines remove waste from the body when kidneys no longer function correctly. Even worse, Tony had suffered damage to his heart too, going into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart, but he was hanging on by a thread. Tony had gone comatose. To keep him alive, his doctors had put him on a ventilator to help him breathe and chilled his body temperature to 91.4 degrees to protect his brain. Gina asked if she could see her brother. The doctor nodded and said that Tony had been sent to the intensive care unit, but he warned her that Tony was in really bad shape, and so it wouldn't be easy to see him like that. Gina nodded and set off for the ICU. A few minutes later, the doctor's words were ringing in Gina's ears when the nurse on duty led her to her brother's door. But the sight of Tony still made Gina stifle a gasp. Her brother lay unconscious on the bed, covered in a pile of gel pads that were cooling his body. His swollen chest heaved up and down as the ventilator pumped oxygen down his throat and into his lungs, all while an IV line sent fluids and medicine into his body. Gina had never seen her big brother look so helpless. She walked up to him and touched his hand. It was cold and limp. Gina always knew Tony's alcohol abuse was going to hurt him if he didn't stop, but she never expected anything this bad. "5 weeks later, Gina stepped into Tony's hospital room carrying an almost empty donut box. Tony had spent 3 weeks in the ICU and then 2 more weeks in a regular hospital room. And as those 5 weeks had passed, Gina had gotten to know every staff member in the wing. And she'd brought them donuts because today was a special day. Tony was finally well enough to move out of the hospital and into a skilled nursing facility. Tony's room was quiet now that many of the monitors and tubes had been disconnected, but he was still bedbound. He needed dialysis 3 times a week while doctors kept trying to save his kidneys, and the ventilator that had been breathing for him was now replaced by a hole in his throat with a tube sticking out, so oxygen could go straight to his lungs. Tony couldn't speak at all because of this tube, but through it all, he was somehow managing to hold up okay emotionally. Gina was genuinely impressed by his determination to get better. Gina sat down next to Tony's bed, looked into his eyes, and took his hand. It was warm and pink, and with great effort, he managed to give her a corny, exaggerated thumbs up. She knew instantly her brother was joking with her. Tony often mocked other people who gave the thumbs up gesture. Gina laughed and gave it right back to him. That was the brother she remembered and loved. Two weeks later, a nurse's aide named Matilda Rogers pulled her cart down the hallway inside of the skilled nursing facility where Tony was staying. Matilda really enjoyed the early shift. In the hours before the building got busy with deliveries and family visits, she had a chance to really connect with most of her patients and give them a little inspiration for the day. She stopped the cart and locked the wheels outside of Tony's room. Tony was one of her favorites. Matilda loved his sense of humor, and she developed a morning ritual of greeting him with a joke or a riddle. During his 2 weeks at the nursing center, Tony had learned to speak again by using a special valve on the hole in his throat. His voice was still raspy and low, but Matilda loved it when she could make him laugh. She also encouraged him to imitate her silly dance moves, and that helped him slowly strengthen his arms and legs, and so he had been making steady progress. But when Matilda stepped into Tony's room, armed with a new joke she'd gotten from her 11-year-old niece, Tony sat stone-faced and silent in the corner. Matilda instantly knew he was not in the mood for jokes this morning. Tony didn't say a word as she crushed his meds into a fine powder and administered them through his feeding tube. When she was done, she washed her hands and asked permission to sit in his guest chair so they could talk. He nodded, so she took a seat and then tried her joke, but Tony didn't respond. She asked if there was something going on that maybe he wanted to share, and eventually, Tony's eyes began to well up, and he would tell her something very strange. He told her in his slow, raspy voice that people from his past had been visiting him in his room. Old friends and family, including folks he hadn't seen for many years, had been suddenly appearing by his bedside. They would stand there and sometimes even speak to Tony for about 10 seconds, but then they would just disappear. Matilda asked him if he'd been having trouble sleeping again. She told him she thought he might have had a disturbing dream, but Tony was adamant that he had not been asleep at all. He said he knew that the people he was seeing in his room were not real, but he definitely was seeing them. It was not a dream. Matilda could see how frightened Tony was and told him she was going to do everything she could to keep him safe. She walked back into the hallway to the medicine cart, then pulled up her notes from the weekly meeting with the staff psychiatrist. She saw that Tony had been prescribed a new sleep medication a few days ago. Her notes from the night nurse said Tony had tolerated it well, and there were no indications that Tony had been suffering bad dreams or hallucinations. She couldn't understand why cheerful Tony had suddenly turned so dark. Matilda finished delivering meds to the rest of the patients along Tony's hallway and returned to Tony's room half an hour later to see how he was doing. His mood had not changed. In fact, he was even more argumentative and agitated. He insisted that 2 of his former coworkers had come to his bedside while she was gone. Matilda said it was too early for visitors, but Tony didn't even seem to hear her. Suddenly, he pointed across the room, his eyes wide, and told Matilda he saw a little girl trying to pick up a needle off the floor behind her. Matilda turned to look, and of course, there was no girl and no needle. That's when Matilda noted that Tony's face was flushed and he was breathing rapidly. When she checked his heart rate and blood pressure, she saw those too were rising. This was moving from perhaps just a bad dream to a potential emergency. Matilda asked the change nurse to call 911. 15 minutes later, she helped escort a flailing, agitated Tony, now strapped to a gurney, into an ambulance for an emergency room evaluation. Dr. Mary Shaughnessy was on duty in the ER when paramedics wheeled in a thrashing, confused Tony. The 35-year-old doctor quickly reviewed the notes sent over by the skilled nursing facility, so she knew that Tony had a host of medical issues, from his damaged heart and kidneys to his recent severe concussion. But the first place she looked for a clue about Tony's erratic behavior was the extensive list of medications he was taking. Dr. Shaughnessy noticed that he'd been taking an antidepressant for a few years, so that was nothing new. Many alcoholics suffer from depression, which is part of the reason they drink to excess. But the psychiatrist at the nursing facility had added a sleeping medication called Ambien just 4 days earlier. Dr. Shaughnessy knew that Ambien can actually cause delirium in some people, even at seemingly normal doses. Maybe that's what was going on with Tony. Dr. Shaughnessy called a psychiatrist to review Tony's blood work, and they agreed that the Ambien could be responsible for Tony's hallucinations. So they took Ambien off of Tony's medication list and sent him back to the nursing facility with a prescription for a different kind of sleep medication. 2 days later, when nurse's aide, Matilda Rogers, parked her medicine cart in front of Tony's room, she was hopeful that Tony was back to his upbeat, positive self. So she walked into Tony's room wearing a big smile, but she found him flopping and rolling around on the floor, gasping and yelling through the speaking valve on his throat. He was clearly having some kind of a seizure, and so Matilda immediately pressed the emergency call button. Matilda managed to get Tony to stop thrashing and tried to calm him down. Through his garbled cries, she could make out that he was clearly terrified that someone was coming to get him. He claimed that smoke was coming through the walls, and his wide eyes scanned the room constantly, looking for some unseen menace. A moment later, 2 staffers raced into the room to help get Tony back onto his bed, followed by the doctor who was on duty. Clearly, something dangerous was going on in Tony's head, and they needed to find out what it was immediately. The doctor asked Matilda to call for an ambulance to take Tony right back to the emergency room. 3 hours later, Dr. Shaughnessy reviewed Tony's lab results on a monitor next to his bed inside of the ER. Tony's sister, Gina, paced back and forth beside her. Gina had made it clear to Dr. Shaughnessy that she was not leaving until someone could explain to her what was going on with her brother. Dr. Shaughnessy wished she knew. Seeing Tony being wheeled back in from the nursing center 48 hours after she had discharged him was discouraging. It meant that her first guess must have been wrong. maybe the Ambien sleeping pills were not causing Tony's problems after all. And there was no denying that Tony's condition had deteriorated. He couldn't tell Dr. Shaughnessy what day it was, or where he was, or where he had just come from. And not only was he more agitated, he now had a low-grade fever, and his heart was racing. In addition, his legs were swollen, and they shook involuntarily when she manipulated his feet. All these signs suggested that Tony might have suffered some injury to his nervous system. Dr. Shaughnessy worried she might have missed something crucial the last time she saw Tony. She had ordered yet another round of scans and x-rays, plus the usual blood work and urinalysis. And all of the tests came back just like the last time, normal. All except the urinalysis. Dr. Shaughnessy explained to Gina that her brother's urine showed that he had contracted a serious urinary tract infection. This sort of infection is common among people who are bedridden, the doctor said, and it could explain Tony's delusions and paranoia. She said that severe UTIs can cause psychological symptoms as the body fights off the bacteria. But she said the good news was that urinary tract infections are completely treatable. Relief washed over Gina's face as Dr. Shaughnessy told her that she was going to admit Tony to the hospital. She was sure that a strong course of antibiotics would get him back on track. Two days later, an attending physician named Lucinda Bragg made her way to Tony's hospital room as she did rounds with her staff. As a senior physician, part of Dr. Bragg's job was to do rounds with the hospital interns and examine particularly challenging cases. And Tony's certainly fit the bill. So far, nobody had been able to figure out what was causing his hallucinations. Dr. Bragg hoped that this collective group might be able to come up with a new idea. As Dr. Bragg introduced herself and the group to Tony, she could see that he remained frightened and trembling, and the monitor showed that his blood pressure and heart rate remained elevated. Dr. Bragg explained to the staff that Tony was being treated for a urinary tract infection that doctors believed was causing the hallucinations. But after 2 days of treatment with strong antibiotics, Dr. Bragg said that Tony's UTI was getting better, but his mental state was not. Just then, Gina entered Tony's room. Dr. Bragg could immediately see the anxiety on Gina's face with all these people in the room, and so Dr. Bragg asked the other doctors to leave for a moment. After reassuring Gina that she was determined to help, Dr. Bragg took another look at Tony's medical history. Everything looked completely normal. There wasn't anything that stood out to her. But then, something occurred to Dr. Bragg. There was a very rare condition that she'd heard about, but had never actually personally treated. It was a condition that most doctors had never heard of, and was caused by something that few people would think could be harmful, let alone potentially fatal. From what Dr. Bragg remembered about it, this condition could cause hallucinations and confusion, affect heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, and have a severe impact on muscle function. Basically, it explained all of Tony's symptoms, and if it was left untreated, it could be devastating. But before Dr. Bragg said anything about this to Gina, she wanted to get a second opinion. So Dr. Bragg excused herself to the hallway and tracked down a neurologist colleague. When Dr. Bragg told the neurologist about her suspicions, the neurologist could hardly believe it. But he double-checked Tony's charts, and from what he could tell, Dr. Bragg had finally found the answer. Tony and his doctors didn't know it, but he had been unknowingly overdosing on a potent chemical that plays a huge role in controlling our moods and feelings. It's called serotonin, and its primary job is to carry messages between nerves in the brain and throughout the body. But serotonin is best known for the way it improves mood. A whole industry has grown up around pills that stimulate the body's production of what many people call the feel-good chemical. And Tony's blood was flooded with it, to the point where it was causing his brain to go haywire and his body to shut down. This condition is called serotonin syndrome, and Tony was experiencing it because of a mix-up in his medications. When Tony was admitted to the skilled nursing facility, he was accidentally prescribed a second antidepressant. Antidepressants work by increasing the serotonin levels in the brain. But even a double dose of these antidepressants was not enough to trigger the adverse effects of serotonin syndrome. However, Tony was also prescribed yet another medication that can increase serotonin levels. This one was a treatment for his heartburn. And so it was this third medication on top of the double dose of antidepressants that combined to cause his serotonin syndrome. And so after the neurologist confirmed Dr. Bragg's diagnosis, Tony was taken off of those 2 antidepressants, and right away he made an incredible recovery. On Sunday night, March 29, 2009, 48-year-old Valerie Looney pulled a fresh hot pizza from an oven at Pizza Plus, a busy restaurant in a small mountain town in Tazewell County, Virginia. Valerie slid the pizza onto a serving tray and then walked around the front counter and delivered it to a booth filled with local police officers. The officers thanked Valerie by name and then dug into their pizza. Valerie checked on the other diners, who had filled up almost all of the booths inside the restaurant, and then afterward, she headed around the front counter and went back into the kitchen. And there, she saw her husband, Harvey, standing by one of the pizza ovens. Valerie was short with cropped brown hair, and Harvey was a big guy with gray hair and a bushy beard. But despite the huge differences in their physical appearances, everybody who knew them thought they had always looked perfect together. Harvey pointed to the clock hanging on the wall by the oven, and he grinned at his wife. He said it was only a few more hours until their 29th anniversary. Valerie smiled back and then jokingly told Harvey to get back to work. Valerie had been the manager at Pizza Plus for over 10 years, and her husband Harvey had been working for her for the past 7 years. The couple knew a lot of people would shudder at the thought of working alongside their spouse day in and day out, but it was actually what Valerie and Harvey had always wanted. In fact, while other people might dream about, making a ton of money or traveling the world, all Valerie and Harvey ever wanted was just to spend as much time together and also with their son Chris as possible. And so Valerie and Harvey working together accomplished a portion of that goal. Harvey got back to work, like his wife had jokingly suggested, and he began to prepare some pizza dough for the next order. As he did that, Valerie stood up on her toes and gave Harvey a kiss on the cheek, and then she headed back into the restaurant's dining room. Pizza Plus was a really popular restaurant in this little town. The entire town only took up a few square miles, and it was surrounded by thick woods and then mountains beyond that, and at times, the people who lived there could feel isolated from the rest of the world. And so Pizza Plus had become almost like a meeting place, where everybody could get together and feel connected to their community, at least for a little while. And Valerie and Harvey had really embraced that aspect of their work. The two of them always seemed so happy and welcoming to patrons. They wanted their customers to feel like they were hanging out with family when they were there. Valerie made her way through the dining room, and she checked in with the police officers to make sure their pizza was good. They told her it was delicious, as always. Then Valerie stepped towards the next booth, but she suddenly stopped and stared down at the floor. One of the police officers noticed and asked her if everything was okay, and Valerie smiled and said it was fine, but she quickly turned and marched right to the back of the restaurant. When she got there, she stepped into the supply closet near the back door, and she saw her employee, Brian Lee, bent down and stocking some shelves. Brian heard his boss approaching him, so he slowly stood up and he turned around. Brian was in his 20s, and he towered over Valerie. Brian asked Valerie what she wanted, and she told him that before he went home tonight, he would need to make sure he mopped the floors in the dining room really, really well, because she was just out there and they looked so dirty. Brian slowly exhaled and had to stop himself from snapping at his boss. Then he just said, "Okay, I'll mop the whole place after we close." Valerie could tell Brian was annoyed at her, but he was always annoyed when he was at work. For a second, Valerie thought about scolding him, but she stopped herself. Instead, she just thanked Brian and then turned and walked back to the front counter. Pizza Plus stayed busy the whole night until they closed around 10 p.m. Valerie and Harvey said goodbye to the last of their customers, and when the dining room was empty, Valerie walked to the counter and opened up the cash register. And while Valerie counted the money and did the paperwork for the night, Brian trudged out to the front of the store and began mopping, and Harvey cleaned up the kitchen and the back of the restaurant. And at some point, after cleaning for a while, Harvey picked up a large bucket of ice and shouted towards the front of the store to Valerie that he was going out back to dump the ice. Valerie responded by saying that Brian was finished with the mopping and she was almost done with the paperwork, so when he was done, they could leave. Harvey carefully picked up the ice bucket, walked out the back door, and dumped the ice onto a small patch of grass. And after he was done, he set the bucket down and Harvey just bent over at the waist, trying to catch his breath. He hated to admit it, and he would never want his wife or his son Chris to see him like this, but even the smallest physical tasks, like dumping this ice, had really started to wear Harvey out. And so after standing outside in private for a couple of seconds there, Harvey was about to go back inside when suddenly he heard screaming coming from inside the restaurant. And so instantly Harvey charged back inside, and the second he did, the screaming got louder and louder, and he called out for his wife, but then a second later the screaming completely stopped and the entire restaurant went completely silent. At 8:40 a.m. the following morning, a woman named Mary Fullen walked down the street towards Pizza Plus. She was on her way to open up the restaurant that day and then work the lunch shift. Mary passed a car wash not far from the restaurant, and she waved to a couple of people outside trying a car. Then she walked a bit further down the street and went around to the back of Pizza Plus. When she got there, she looked down and reached into her pocket to grab her key to the back door. But when she looked up, she saw Harvey laying face down right behind the back of the store. And so Mary ran over to him and began yelling his name, but as she did, she could see he was laying in a pool of blood. Mary shook him like it might wake him up, but she knew he was dead. And so in a total panic, Mary threw open the back door of the restaurant, barely noticing she didn't have to use her key to get in. And then once inside, she ran for the phone on the front counter to call police. But before she could even get there, when she was in the kitchen, she looked down and found Valerie, who was also on the floor, blood covering her hair and her clothes. It was obvious that she was dead too. And so Mary began crying and her whole body was shaking, but she still made it to the phone and she dialed 911. The operator told her police would be right there and that for now she needed to get out of the restaurant immediately. And so Mary hung up and just ran out the front door, not noticing that that door too was also unlocked. A few minutes later, the Tazewell chief of police, David Mills, pulled up in front of the Pizza Plus and just sat there in his car for a minute. When the call had come into the station, Mills and the small group of officers who worked under him couldn't believe it. They all knew Valerie and Harvey really well. In fact, they usually went to Pizza Plus as a group at least a few times a week. Mills looked out his windshield and he saw a couple of officers from the county sheriff's department standing with Mary in front of the restaurant, the woman who had called this in. Mills took a long, deep breath, then stepped out of his car and went up and joined them. All of the officers knew Mary about as well as they knew Valerie and Harvey. Mills could see Mary was a total wreck, and so while he didn't want to press her too hard, he did ask her if she could just fill him in on everything she had seen and heard that morning. Mary told Mills she'd been coming in to open the restaurant when she had found Harvey out back, and then when she ran inside to use the phone, she found Valerie lying on the kitchen floor. Mills told Mary he was so sorry she had to see that, and then he asked her if she had had to use her key to unlock the door when she went inside. Mary looked like she hadn't even thought about this, and then she told Mills and the other officers that were there that actually the back door had been unlocked when she ran in. And also, now that she thought about it, the front door had also been unlocked when she ran back out again. Mills thanked her and then asked her to please wait outside. Then Mills and one of the county officers put on their gloves and walked into the restaurant. The sight of Valerie laying there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by a huge pool of blood, almost knocked Mills back. He had known Valerie for years, and he couldn't remember a single person ever speaking badly about her. It might sound foolish to people outside of the area, but as the manager of the local pizza place, Valerie was a huge part of this community. And sometimes, after a bad day, a good slice of pizza and a great conversation with Valerie could turn everything around. Mills and the county officer went over and knelt down and began to examine Valerie's body, and it was even worse than they thought. Valerie had several horrible wounds on her head and neck. In fact, she had been attacked so violently that she had almost been decapitated. After a moment, Mills and the other officer stepped back from the body, and they both just could not believe what they were looking at. This was not a town where homicides happen very often. And for these two officers, and basically all the officers on site, they had never dealt with anything this gruesome. Mills and the other officer collected themselves, and then Mills noticed that from where he was standing, he could see the front counter. And he noticed at the front counter was the cash register, and the drawer was open, and it appeared to be empty. So Mills's first thought was that somebody had come in to rob the place when Valerie was counting cash and closing for the night. And maybe Valerie put up a fight, and the robber attacked her and killed her. And then obviously at some point after that, Harvey must have gotten involved and gotten attacked and killed too. The investigators headed down a hallway to the back door and they stepped outside. And there, they saw Harvey's body on the ground. He did have one major wound, but it didn't look like the attack on him had been nearly as violent as the one on his wife. Mills knew they still needed to do a thorough sweep of the restaurant, but already just the sight of these two bodies made it clear to him that neither the local police nor the county sheriff had the resources to deal with a case like this on their own. There had not been a recorded robbery homicide in the county in 20 years, and as far as Mills knew, there had actually never been a double homicide in this area, and certainly not one that involved this level of brutality. So Mills grabbed his cell phone and he made a call to the Virginia State Police. And then after the call, he and the other officer went back into the Pizza Plus and began searching the entire restaurant. And it wouldn't take them long to find multiple pieces of evidence that seemed to paint a picture of a vicious struggle that had taken place the night before. Mills located blood spatter on the pizza ovens not far from Valerie's body, and he saw bloodstains in the sink, like maybe the killer or killers had tried and failed to clean up after themselves. Then Mills heard the other officer calling for him. The officer was standing a few feet away from the pizza ovens, staring at a fire extinguisher that was hanging on the wall. And when Mills joined him and looked at the extinguisher, he saw all these bloodstains on the bottom of it, and so it seemed like the extinguisher had to have been one of the murder weapons. A moment later, the two policemen left the kitchen and headed down towards the hall towards the back door again, where Harvey's body was. They had already searched the area once, but this time they were going to do a more thorough search. And this time they noticed a mop leaning up against the wall next to a bucket. Mills walked over to it and knelt down, and he noticed in the mop head were several pinkish spots that looked like blood. And what struck both investigators about this mop and the bloody fire extinguisher as kind of odd was that after both items had been used, it looked like they had been placed back where they belonged. They just kind of put them back as if nobody would notice. And so Mills and the other officer began speculating about who would do something like that, and they both agreed that, while this was kind of a flimsy theory, it seemed like maybe it was an employee who was responsible, because an employee would know where the fire extinguisher went and where the mop went. They both seemed to be back where they belonged, and so perhaps just kind of out of habit, they put those things back. A few minutes later, Mills and the other officer started yet another walk through the restaurant, and as they did, they heard several cars pull up out front. Mills stopped what he was doing and went outside, and there he saw members of the Virginia State Police and a state forensics team heading his way. A man wearing a dark suit extended his hand and introduced himself as Agent John Santola of the Virginia State Police. Mills shook Santola's hand, introduced himself, and said he was glad to have some help. Then Agent Santola and the forensics team walked inside the restaurant to take blood samples and look for other possible DNA samples, and as Mills stood there outside, something suddenly hit him. He would now have to go tell Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris, that his parents were dead. While state police searched the Pizza Plus, Mills and the county officer drove across town to the small trailer where Valerie, Harvey, and Chris had all lived together. When they got there, Mills walked up to the door and knocked, and shortly after, Chris answered. Chris was 28 years old, he wore a black sweatshirt and jeans, and he looked really confused to see two police officers standing there. He asked Mills if everything was okay, but Mills just shook his head and asked if they could come inside. Chris said, yeah, of course, and he let the officers in. And then once Mills and his partner got inside, Mills just turned to Chris, and with a sad look on his face, he told him that unfortunately, both of his parents were deceased. They had been attacked and killed at the restaurant. For a moment, Chris just stared at Mills like he was in total shock, and then he began shaking his head and said, no, that doesn't make any sense. Today, his parents were out of town on a trip for their 29th wedding anniversary. But Mills just shook his head and said he was very sorry, but that could not be true. His parents had not left town. In fact, they had never left the restaurant the night before. Chris eventually sat down and just stayed silent for a couple of minutes, and the officers just waited. And then, with a shaky voice, Chris said he should have known something was wrong when he didn't hear his mother and father come home the night before, and then also this morning when he didn't see them. But Chris said he had just assumed his parents got home when he was already asleep, and that they had left that morning before he woke up to go on their trip. But now he felt like it was obvious there had been an issue. Mills nodded his head and said he was sorry to have to do this, but he did need to ask some pretty pointed questions about his parents, and Chris just nodded. And so Mills asked Chris where he was the night before, and Chris said he had been at work, and then afterward he had come home, hung out for a bit, and then went to bed. Then Mills asked Chris what his relationship was like with his parents. Chris said their relationship had been good. He had been forced to move back in with his parents after going through a divorce, and he felt bad about it, but his mom and dad seemed happy to have him at home. After that, Mills asked Chris if he could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against either of his parents, and Chris just shook his head and said absolutely not. Everybody loved his mom and dad. Mills knew this was actually pretty much the truth. I mean, Harvey and Valerie were beloved in this town, so he wasn't surprised their son couldn't think of anyone. Mills said how sorry he was for Chris's loss, and he promised the police would do everything they could to get the person who had killed his parents. Then Mills and the other officer turned to leave, but then Chris told them to hold on for a second. Mills turned around, and Chris asked him if a guy named Brian Lee had been working with his parents the night before. Mills admitted they had not gotten that far yet, but he asked Chris why would it matter if Brian in particular had been working. Chris just said his mom complained a lot about Brian and often got into arguments with him whenever they were working together. Mills thanked Chris for the information and said they'd be in touch, and then he and the other officer walked outside, got in the car, and headed back to the crime scene. And on the way, Mills called into the station and asked them to get in touch with Brian Lee. On March 31st, so 2 days after Valerie and Harvey's murders, Police Chief Mills and Agent Santola met Brian Lee as he walked into the local police station. Brian was young and very tall, and he already looked like he wanted to turn around and make a run for it. The news about the murders had spread through town almost as soon as cop cars started pulling up to the Pizza Plus, so Brian knew exactly why he'd been brought in. Mills and Santola led Brian to a small interview room, and inside was a table and chairs. Brian sat down on one side, Mills and Santola sat down on the other. And pretty much right away, what investigators noticed was Brian just could not sit still. And then, before the interview really even got going, Brian said something that totally threw off Mills and Santola. Brian wanted to know how much cash the killer had taken from the register. Now, nobody had told Brian that the register had been robbed, but the investigators knew this news could have gotten out pretty easily. Still, they were surprised that Brian's first question, when two people he worked closely with had been murdered, was about the money in the register. Agent Santola said they couldn't discuss those details with Brian. And then after that, he asked Brian to please talk them through the last time he had seen Valerie and Harvey. Brian said he'd been working with the couple on the night they were killed, and the place had been pretty busy. Then, once they closed, he said he mopped the whole restaurant, just like Valerie had told him to do, and then after that, he clocked out and he left. Now, right away, the mop stood out to Mills because they had found blood on the head of the mop. And so Mills, as discreetly as he could, asked Brian where he left the mop when he left. And Brian quickly said he left it close to the back door, where it was supposed to go. Mills followed up this question by asking if anybody else was still at the restaurant when he had left. Brian seemed confused, and he said, yeah, of course, Valerie and Harvey were still there. Valerie was doing paperwork, and Harvey was waiting for her to finish. After he said this, Santola just stared across the table at Brian, not saying anything, and this seemed to really make Brian uncomfortable. But Santola was not actually trying to intimidate this kid or anything, he was just trying to size him up to see if he fit the profile of the murderer. Brian was young and certainly looked strong enough and big enough to overpower the older married couple, but Valerie's murder had been so violent, so gruesome, that Santola really believed the killer had to have been harboring some deep anger against her. This just didn't seem like a crime that could be committed by a stranger. Santola finally broke his silence and asked Brian if he'd recently had an argument with Valerie, and Brian responded by laughing. Santola and Mills looked at each other confused. This was not the response either of them had expected. But then Brian explained and said that he and Valerie had a whole bunch of arguments all the time, because in his opinion, Valerie was a really tough manager and she was always riding him at work. And sometimes he just didn't want to put up with it, and so he snapped back at her and they'd get into these arguments. But then Brian noticed the investigator's reaction to his laughing, and he quickly stopped laughing and got a much more serious look on his face. And then he clarified by saying that, he might not have liked Valerie as a boss, but he would never hurt her. That was crazy. A lot of people don't like their bosses, but they don't kill them. Santola and Mills would follow up with a few more questions, and then eventually they would tell Brian he could leave. But as soon as he was gone, they both agreed that Brian was definitely a primary suspect. Over the following days, local, county, and state investigators looked further into Brian's background. And as they did that, they waited for results from tests that the crime lab was running on the blood samples that had been found at the crime scene. But while they waited, Santola and Mills did not want to overlook any possibilities. They both believed the most likely killer was somebody who worked at Pizza Plus, even if it turned out not to be Brian. So they went ahead and met with every single current employee. But when they spoke to Mary, the employee who had actually found the two bodies and called 911, she said she thought there might be another possibility. She said the car wash that was right by Pizza Plus was one of the main spots in town where people bought and sold drugs. And Mary said some of these buyers and dealers, who were pretty easy to spot, came into the pizza place quite often. And she said one of those people in particular, a guy named Homer, was really creepy. In fact, Mary and Valerie talked about how creepy Homer was. Mills got some information about Homer from Mary and then thanked her for the help. Now, Mills knew there had always been issues with drugs around that car wash, but these were not big-time drug dealers or anything, and so the idea that one of them had been crazed enough to rob the Pizza Plus and brutally murder 2 people inside seemed far-fetched. But still, Mary had said Valerie had been creeped out by this Homer guy, and so Mills and Santola couldn't ignore that. The investigators would track Homer down at the car wash, and at first glance, he really wasn't scary or angry or creepy or anything. He was just really quiet-seeming. Santola asked Homer if he had recently spoken to Valerie or Harvey, and Homer would say he had seen both of them at Pizza Plus on the night they died, but he had not spoken to either of them. But Mills quickly jumped in and said that didn't make sense, because if Homer really went into the restaurant that night, he definitely would have talked to one or both of them when he was ordering or getting his food. But Homer shook his head and said he actually didn't go inside the restaurant. He said he had just sat in his car in the Pizza Plus parking lot, and then through the window, he had seen Valerie, Harvey, and all the other patrons and employees inside the restaurant. Mills was confused and asked Homer, wait a minute, you just sat in the parking lot watching people eat pizza? And Homer, whose expression was totally neutral, just nodded and said, yeah. And then he said after a few minutes of sitting there watching people eat, he drove home. Santola and Mills didn't know what to make of Homer. They tried to ask him questions to figure out why he was doing that and did he do this often, but really Homer didn't offer much of anything. He just seemed incredibly creepy. And so eventually, when the investigators left because they weren't getting anywhere talking to Homer, they got in their car and they're both like, wait, who is this guy? Was he a stalker? Is he casing the place so we could rob it later? Or is he just kind of strange and lonely? But whatever the answers were, the investigators now had another viable suspect. In addition to the Pizza Plus employee, Brian, they now had Homer. And they held out hope that when all the forensics evidence came back, it would point to one of them. On April 3rd, 2009, so a week after the murders, Pizza Plus was once again filled with laughter and conversation. The crime scene had been cleared, and now this was a gathering place once again. But this time, the community had come here not to eat pizza, but to pay their respects to Valerie and Harvey. There had been a funeral service for the couple at a local church, but everybody who knew them knew this restaurant is where they would want people to come, and they would also want people to have a good time. So Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris, and other members of the family thanked everyone for coming in and encouraged them all to take up seats in all the booths and just start sharing stories of all their favorite memories with the couple. And so over the course of the day, several local and county police officers came by the restaurant. Now, it's actually common for police to attend funerals of murder victims, basically to study the actions of people who were close to the victim, to look for suspects, but that was not why most of the cops were here today. So many of them had spent several nights a week in Pizza Plus, eating pizza and chatting with Valerie and Harvey. It was part of their routine. And so the officers were here to honor their memories, same as everybody else. In the days and weeks that followed the funeral and that memorial service inside of the restaurant, investigators continued to pursue 2 different theories. The first theory was that Brian, or another Pizza Plus employee, had some issue with Valerie or Harvey or both, and they carried out the murders as a result of that. The other theory was Homer, the man who had watched Valerie through the window from the parking lot, who also was involved in drugs, could have killed Valerie and Harvey because he was robbing the place for drug money, or maybe he killed them for, some other motive that had not been discovered yet. And so police interviewed and re-interviewed everybody working at Pizza Plus, and they also expanded their search to include former employees. And simultaneously, they looked into people who were associated with Homer. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. And to make things worse for investigators, the test results from the crime lab came back as inconclusive. The forensics team had identified the victim's blood in the restaurant, but they could not find clear DNA samples pointing to anybody else. Eventually, Agent Santola got called away from the case to work on other state police business, and the case really began to weigh even heavier on Police Chief Mills, who now was basically running the investigation on his own. And pretty quickly, Mills began to lose sleep over this case. He felt like his team was always so close to solving the crime, but no new concrete evidence ever appeared, and so they never had enough to pin the murder on any of their suspects. Months and months went by, and then years went by, and still Mills could not figure out who killed Valerie and Harvey. And then eventually, when still this case had not been solved, Mills retired. And so with Mills gone and no new leads coming in, this double homicide became the only cold case in Tazewell County. And so family and friends had all but given up on the chance that Valerie and Harvey's killer would ever be brought to justice. But then, years after the murders, a new police chief and a new county sheriff decided that reopening and solving this cold case had to be their top priority. And they made a decision that would finally crack the whole thing wide open. On February 13, 2013, almost 4 years after Valerie and Harvey's murder, a man named Rich Byington walked into the Tazewell County Sheriff's Department. Rich looked like an average middle-aged guy in a golf shirt and khaki pants, but he just so happened to be one of the most effective interrogators in the entire United States. Rich was so good, he actually taught other members of law enforcement how to interrogate, and he taught a very specific form of interrogation. It was known as the Reed technique. The new sheriff and one of his deputies met Rich as he walked into the building. The sheriff thanked him for coming in, and Rich said he was happy to help. Rich had spent the last several weeks going over the cold case and talking with past and present law enforcement officers who had worked on it. And Rich, like the sheriff, knew that these officers were smart, dedicated, and hardworking, but none of them had had any real experience interrogating murder suspects until the murders of Valerie and Harvey. And Rich believed that employing the right interrogation tactics with this case would make all the difference. He felt like he just needed a chance to sit down face-to-face with one of these potential killers. The deputy led Rich into an interview room, and both men would sit down on the other side of a table from one of the major suspects in the case. And not long after that, Rich began his interrogation. Among other things, the Reed technique creates a high-pressure environment for the person being interviewed, and it combines this pressure with words and acts of sympathy shown towards the suspect. And so Rich, who was famous for using the Reed technique, began using it during this interview. And throughout the interview, as planned, the suspect could never really seem to get their footing, and every time they started to look comfortable, Rich would throw a question at them or made an outright accusation that sent the suspect back into a panic. Hours went by, and the deputy could not believe that Rich just never seemed to tire. He just kept going, wearing the suspect down, and then making the suspect believe the police were really on their side, over and over and over again. And then finally, well into this interview, in this totally calm, caring voice, Rich laid out to the suspect what he believed had actually happened to Valerie and Harvey. And the Reed technique must have worked, because as Rich spoke, this suspect, who police had interviewed multiple times over the course of several years, finally broke down and confessed to everything. By the time Rich left the sheriff's department, investigators finally knew who had murdered Valerie and Harvey Looney. Based on that suspect's confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Valerie and Harvey at the Pizza Plus restaurant on March 29, 2009. That night, around 10:30 p.m., the killer walked across the Pizza Plus dining room towards the front counter. There, they saw Valerie, bent over the register, counting out the cash. The killer cleared their throat to get Valerie's attention, and Valerie looked up, at which point the killer asked her a question. And when she answered, the killer started shouting at Valerie, but Valerie wasn't intimidated. She shouted right back, and soon the two of them were having a full-blown fight right there in the middle of the restaurant. And at some point, the killer got so mad and so frustrated that they rushed at Valerie, and Valerie screamed and tried to run away, but the killer chased her into the kitchen and grabbed her with one hand, then picked up a large knife with the other. Valerie struggled and fought, but she couldn't break free, and the killer raised the knife and slit Valerie's throat. Valerie fell to the floor, bleeding profusely, and the killer just dropped the knife. But suddenly, the killer heard shouting and footsteps coming from the back of the restaurant, and so the killer turned and saw Harvey charging down the hall. The killer rushed at him, and Harvey managed to punch the killer, but he quickly realized he was no match for them, and so Harvey turned and tried to run towards the back door, but the killer followed and managed to grab Harvey right by the door, and the killer wrapped their hands around Harvey's throat and began to choke him. Harvey fought as much as he could and managed to stumble out through the back door onto the ground outside. The killer scrambled to their feet and managed to grab Harvey's throat again and kept on squeezing. But at some point, Harvey managed to buck the killer off one more time, and the killer was about to re-engage for a third time when Harvey just kind of abruptly fell forward on his face and just lay there motionless. It would turn out Harvey actually just had a heart attack. And so the killer just stood there for a second, not really sure what to make of this, and then they turned and ran back inside to the kitchen. There, they saw Valerie face down in a pool of blood, but the killer wanted to make sure she really was dead. So the killer grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall, stood over Valerie, and raised it up and began slamming it down over and over again into the back of her head. And after nearly decapitating her, the killer put the fire extinguisher back where it went on the wall, blood still all over it, and then they picked up the knife they had used to slit Valerie's throat. Then they walked out through the back door to where Harvey was still lying motionless on the ground, and just like the killer had done with Harvey's wife, they wanted to be sure Harvey really was dead. So the killer bent down and used that knife and slit Harvey's throat as well. After that, the killer went inside, they grabbed the mop and bucket by the back door, they went to the kitchen and filled that bucket with water. They grabbed the cash out of the register and pocketed that, and then they mopped their way out through the back of the store, trying to get the floor as clean as they could without spending too much more time inside of the restaurant. After wringing out the mop and emptying the water, the killer left the mop and bucket by the back door, walked outside past Harvey's body, and disappeared into the night. The following day, the killer went into work like nothing had happened, and then they went home and waited patiently for the police to arrive to tell them that their mother and father had been killed. Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris Looney, murdered his parents in cold blood. It turned out that after his divorce, Chris had been struggling with money. And so Valerie and Harvey had helped him for a while, but they had had enough. So on the night of the murder, Chris went to Pizza Plus one last time to ask for money, but Chris had already planned on killing his parents if they denied him. Because Chris knew his parents had a $245,000 life insurance policy, and Chris was the beneficiary. And so when Chris's mom refused to give him money and started fighting with him in the restaurant, Chris went through with his plan B. He murdered his parents and then stole the money from the cash register to make it look like a robbery. Investigators had suspected Chris once they learned about this life insurance policy, but it was also the placement of the fire extinguisher and the mop that made him stand out to the police. Mills and the other investigators had always suspected a Pizza Plus employee had carried out the murders, because the fire extinguisher, which was one of the murder weapons, and the mop had been put back exactly where an employee would put them, almost like it was habit. That was one of the primary reasons they had suspected Brian Lee early on. Now, Chris was not a Pizza Plus employee, however, when he was younger, he had been. And so over the course of several years, Mills and others felt like they were close to being able to prove Chris had done it, and they had interviewed him several times, but they could never find enough evidence or get him to admit to the crime. That is, until the new leaders of the investigation called in Rich Byington, the interrogation expert, for help. And after Rich faced off with Chris, Chris would confess to the murders and would tell police exactly how and why he had killed his own parents. Chris Looney was found guilty and was given 2 life sentences. After the trial, members of Valerie, Harvey, and Chris's family issued a joint statement. It said, quote, "Chris, we love you and forever will love you, but we cannot forgive what you have done." End quote. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his 2 daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer, that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it, and it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board. They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again, mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time. And the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark. It's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seem sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound. It was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic. Like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom and she goes up to her big sister and she's like, do you hear that tapping sound? And Tina's like, yeah, what is that? And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her? And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, Mom, is that you down there? And immediately there's a response. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question.
And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother. And again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom. And even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor and they're hearing this tapping and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from mom. It was great. And eventually, after 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her. Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. I mean, they've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. I mean, he's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, you know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure of it. And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms, and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue, and they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen, they were coming sometimes from the second floor, they were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all. But he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping. Because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets, and it was frightening. And they would call their dad in, and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. Like, it's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls, like, hey, come on, guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. Like, there's nothing that's going to harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You got to let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like when dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls, because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're going to have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate, because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is, but she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen, she goes to the door to the basement, Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like, every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was a washing machine or something, because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then, and then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound because it's real for them. Like maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house. There has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet, come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified. And they sprint up the stairs, they bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls, we don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house, you're safe here, we'll wait for your dad to come home, he'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical, they go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank, at this point, in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere, but there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me," but it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and he talks to his girls, and he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning, and he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls, like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted. And I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning, so we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds, but they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them, like zero, and it was not going to change. And on some level, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so in this sort of vulnerable moment where the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad, "Fine, whatever, we'll go to grief counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling, and right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1986. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm, there's no more tapping, nothing, everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house, and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks, that's weird. I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, "No, that's weird." So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. If you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like, he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen. He's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. With the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. And he's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the two daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house, like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all three girls, the two daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic, nobody there either. They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement, like there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs, and he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls who are so shocked, they're just in silence, staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom. So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut. And there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in. There's this vicious struggle. And Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground, she runs next door to that neighbor's house, she slams on the door, the neighbor comes out and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house!" And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency. They call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up, and when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, And Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom and he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down. So everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house. And now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property, and we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here. And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household. And despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. There was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town. There was no leads and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Basically nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, you know what, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house, because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff, and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what, just in case, I need to call the police because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone and he calls the police and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door. He opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, "I'm going to kill you, Tina," or "I'm going to kill you, Karen." And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements, and so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like, clearly, the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened, because they didn't do this, somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They look everywhere, and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives, that's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, "This is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it?" And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, "Yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss?" And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now, Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching, and he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm going to pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from "it's your mom and it's good" to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafson's house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. Danny LaPlante is still alive, and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it, he did not get parole, but during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen's podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories,